Zara had always been fascinated by the unknown. As an explorer from the Vornak Empire, she was used to visiting strange, distant worlds, but nothing quite intrigued her like Earth. The humans were different from any species she had studied before. From the moment she arrived on the planet, Zara knew that Earth wasn't like the other worlds her people had visited. She stepped off her spaceship, hidden in a quiet part of the Earth's forest, looking around with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Zara had studied Earth from a distance, and while her people thought humans were nothing special, Zara felt something different. She was determined to learn more about them, to understand what made this species stand out. There was something about them, something she couldn't quite explain, that felt worth discovering. As a member of the Vornak, a species that had conquered countless planets, Zara had been raised with the idea that other races were just obstacles to be studied or controlled. The Vornak Empire was all about efficiency and logic. They had no room for sentiment or unnecessary emotion. Everything was calculated, every move deliberate. But Earth felt different. The humans, in their chaos and unpredictability, had a certain fire about them. There was something in their spirit that Zara couldn't ignore. She had heard of human males, of course. They were a part of the Earthlings' most dominant gender, but they weren't known for anything extraordinary. Their technology was still in its early stages compared to the Vornak, and their bodies, while functional, were far weaker than the Vornaks. Human males were often portrayed as reckless or aggressive in the data Zara had read, but none of it felt like a complete picture. Something was missing, and Zara intended to find out what it was. Zara's mission was clear: gather information. She was supposed to observe and report back. Her superiors had told her that Earth was nothing to worry about. The human males were not a threat. They were simple, primitive beings who lived in small, scattered groups. Her job was to watch from afar, analyze, and then return home with her findings. But Zara couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. The humans seemed so passionate. Even from the surface, she could tell they had deep emotions, and that interested her. Her race was rational, too rational. Sometimes, they lacked the spark of chaos, the kind of unpredictability that humans seemed to have. She couldn't help but wonder, what was it about the human males that set them apart? With each passing day, Zara observed them from the shadows. She watched how they interacted with each other, how they built their cities, how they fought wars. The more she watched, the more she realized just how much of their world revolved around their emotions. It was something the Vornak could never fully understand or appreciate. To them, emotion was a weakness, something that could cloud judgment. But humans, they wore their emotions on their sleeves, and somehow it made them stronger. Zara was particularly interested in how human males seemed to fight for each other, how they took risks to protect their families and communities. She'd seen human males battle fierce enemies with nothing but the strength of their will to back them up. The Vornak, with all their power and advanced technology, rarely fought with such raw passion. One night, while watching from the forest's edge, Zara saw a group of humans fighting back against an attack from another species. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned, yet they stood their ground. It wasn't just survival instinct. It was something deeper, something Zara had never seen before in the countless other species she had studied. These human males were fighting not just for their lives but for each other. She watched as one man, covered in dirt and blood, helped another up, urging him to keep fighting despite the odds. Zara could see the pain in their eyes, but it didn't stop them. If anything, it pushed them harder. The human males didn't run. They didn't give up. They fought until the last breath, not just to protect themselves but to protect the others. Zara couldn't understand it. The Vornak didn't fight for each other like this. They fought for survival, yes, but not for the deep emotional connection that these humans seemed to share. It was clear that there was something more to this species, something the Vornak had missed in their cold, logical analysis. The next day, Zara returned to her hidden ship, her mind swirling with questions. Why did humans fight like that? Why did they push themselves so hard, even when there was no chance of victory. Zara had been trained to see the world through a logical, detached lens, but the humans, especially their males, were challenging everything she knew. She needed to understand more. But her mission was clear. She couldn't get too close. If she did, it would risk exposure. Zara had seen firsthand how suspicious human males could be. They didn't trust outsiders easily, especially those who looked like they didn't belong. She needed to tread carefully, stay hidden, and gather information without drawing attention to herself. But as the days passed, Zara found it harder and harder to stay detached. Every time she saw the human males, she was drawn to them. There was something magnetic about their strength, their determination, and the way they seemed to push forward no matter what. It wasn't just physical strength that amazed her. It was their resilience, their ability to rise above difficult situations, to protect those they cared about, no matter the cost. Zara found herself spending more and more time observing them. She watched them in their homes, in their communities, and on the battlefield. Each time, she found herself more and more captivated by them. The Vornak had never fought for love. They fought for power, for control, but these humans, especially the males, fought for something far greater. They fought for each other. They fought for family. They fought for hope. Zara's thoughts were interrupted when she received a communication from her superior. Commander Lyrics, her superior, had been monitoring her progress from the Vornak fleet. He wasn't pleased with how things were going. Zara. Lyrics's voice crackled through her communicator. I trust you haven't forgotten the mission. You were sent to observe the humans, not to get distracted by their meaningless emotions. Zara felt a pang of guilt, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward the human males. There was something inside her, something she couldn't quite explain, that told her there was more to them than just primitive behavior. They had strength, yes, but it was the kind of strength that came from within, from the heart, and that made them unique, even dangerous. I haven't forgotten, Commander, Zara replied, her voice steady. But there's something here, something that I didn't expect. These humans, especially the males, are unlike anything I've seen before. They are driven by something more than just survival. There's a depth to them, something that challenges everything we know. Commander Lyrics's tone grew sharper. Do not forget your mission, Zara. The humans are not a threat. They are nothing compared to us. Do not let their primitive emotions cloud your judgment. Zara hesitated for a moment, torn between her mission and her growing fascination with the humans. She knew her mission was to gather information and report back, but there was something inside her that urged her to stay, to learn more about the human males. She couldn't let go of the feeling that they were capable of something incredible, something her people could never understand. I understand, Commander, Zara finally said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I will continue my observations, but there's more to these humans than you think. I can feel it. As Zara ended the communication, she stood on the edge of the forest, watching the humans go about their lives. The more she watched, the more she realized one undeniable truth. Human males were not to be underestimated. They had something that Zara couldn't quite grasp, but she was determined to find out what it was. And so, she continued her mission, but this time with a different focus. She wasn't just observing the humans anymore. She was studying them, and in doing so, she was beginning to understand that the truth about human males might just be more shocking than she ever expected. After Zara's conversation with Commander Lyrics, she found herself in a dilemma. She had always been a dedicated Vornak, loyal to her people's mission, but something about the human males kept pulling her in. They weren't like the cold, calculating species the Vornak often encountered. They were unpredictable, passionate, and deeply committed to protecting their own. And Zara couldn't help but feel a growing curiosity about them. So Zara decided to spend more time observing the humans, especially the males. She knew that her mission was to study them from a distance, without interfering in their daily lives. But this felt different. She felt as though she were on the edge of something important. The more she watched, the more questions she had. What drove these humans? Why were they willing to sacrifice so much for each other? For their families? Why did they seem to fight for each other with such fierce loyalty? Zara decided to observe a small town in the middle of nowhere. The humans in this community seemed to live a simple life, working together to grow crops, build homes, and raise their families. From what Zara had learned, these small villages were where the heart of human culture was found. She wanted to see how the human males interacted with each other and with their families. At first, it seemed like a normal human village. The houses were made of wood, and the streets were dirt paths worn down by years of use. The men worked alongside the women and children, their hands rough from hard work, but their faces often lit up with laughter and joy. Zara spent several days watching them, carefully hiding in the shadows, making sure no one noticed her presence. She noticed something strange. The males didn't act the way she expected. They weren't distant or detached. They weren't focused solely on their own survival. They didn't behave like the cold, emotionless soldiers she had read about in the data reports. Instead, the human males seemed to be constantly looking out for each other. It wasn't just about getting ahead individually. It was about taking care of the group, about ensuring that no one was left behind. One day, Zara watched a group of human males working together to build a fence around the town's fields. They were carrying large wooden beams, lifting them with ease, and coordinating their movements. What struck Zara was how they communicated. There was no yelling or fighting for dominance. Instead, they spoke calmly to each other, each taking on a role, trusting the others to do their part. When one of the men dropped a heavy beam, another quickly stepped forward to help him without hesitation. Zara had expected to see competition, to see these males trying to prove their strength or superiority. But instead, she saw teamwork. She saw them working together for a common goal. She saw them looking out for one another, making sure no one was overworked or injured. There was a unity among them that Zara had never seen in any other species. Over the next few days, Zara's observations became more intense. She watched how the human males interacted not just with each other, but with their families. She saw them return home after a long day of work, tired and sweaty, but still making the effort to spend time with their wives and children. Zara couldn't help but notice the warmth in their eyes when they spoke to their families. There was no coldness, no detachment. It was as though the human males were deeply connected to the people they loved. One evening, Zara followed a man named David as he walked home from the village's marketplace. He had just finished his work for the day, and Zara watched as he approached his house. His wife, Sarah, was sitting on the porch, holding their young daughter, Lily. As soon as David saw them, his face lit up with a smile. It was a smile that spoke of love, of connection, of a deep bond that Zara couldn't quite understand. He kissed his wife on the cheek, then picked up his daughter, holding her tightly in his arms. Zara stood in the shadows, her heart pounding as she watched. The scene before her felt so human. It was something she had never seen before in any other species, and it left her feeling both confused and fascinated. In Zara's world, emotion was often seen as a weakness. The Vornak believed in logic and efficiency, not love or tenderness. But here, on Earth, love seemed to be the driving force behind everything. The human males didn't just fight for survival. They fought for the people they cared about. They worked hard every day, not just for themselves, but for their families, for their communities. And Zara couldn't help but be amazed by the depth of their devotion. These men didn't fight for power or glory. They fought for something much more powerful, the ones they loved. As Zara continued to watch David and the other males in the village, she noticed something else that set them apart. When something went wrong, when things became difficult, the human males didn't just give up. They didn't quit or turn their backs on their problems. They faced challenges head-on, even when the odds were stacked against them. Whether it was a dangerous storm, a broken fence, or a conflict with another village, the human males didn't back down. They stood their ground, determined to protect what they loved. Zara saw one particularly striking example of this determination when a group of wild animals attacked the village's livestock. The human males gathered together immediately, without hesitation. They grabbed weapons, called for help, and worked together to defend the animals and their families. Zara watched as David, the same man she had been observing, led the charge. He was injured during the fight, but he kept pushing forward, determined to protect the animals and the people in the village. Zara had never seen anything like it. The human males didn't hesitate. They didn't think twice about putting their lives on the line to protect those they loved. It was almost as though their devotion to their families and communities gave them an incredible strength, one that went beyond anything Zara had ever witnessed. It wasn't just physical strength, it was emotional strength. The drive to protect and care for others seemed to give these men a power that Zara couldn't explain. Days turned into weeks, and Zara's fascination with the human males only grew. She had come to Earth to observe, to gather information about a species her people had dismissed as insignificant. But now she couldn't stop thinking about them. She couldn't stop wondering what it was that made the human males so different from the other species she had encountered. It was as if they had a fire within them, a fire that drove them to protect, to love, and to fight for what mattered. Zara wasn't sure what to do with this new knowledge. The more she observed, the more she realized that humans, and especially human males, were unlike any species she had ever encountered. They were driven by something deeper than survival. They were driven by love, by the need to protect, and by the belief that their actions could make the world a better place. As Zara continued her observations, she began to ask herself an important question. Was it possible that the humans, these unpredictable, emotional creatures, had something her people didn't? Something that made them stronger, something that made them worth protecting. She had come to Earth to observe, but now she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to these humans than anyone had realized. As Zara watched the human males, with their love and devotion, she began to feel a shift inside her. Perhaps the truth wasn't just in the cold logic of the Vornek. It was in the heart of humanity, the drive to protect and care for others, no matter the cost. And so, Zara continued to watch, knowing that her discovery was only just beginning. Zara stood hidden in the shadows, watching as the humans around her carried on with their daily routines. She had been sent to Earth to observe, to gather information about the human race. But lately, things were beginning to feel different. The human males, especially the ones in the small village she was studying, had started to fascinate her in ways she couldn't explain. Zara was from the Vornek, a species that valued logic, efficiency, and control. Her people had conquered many worlds, bringing order and reason wherever they went. The Vornek had no time for emotions. They saw them as distractions that clouded judgment and weakened strength. In her training, Zara had been taught to see the world in terms of facts and outcomes, not feelings and personal connections. But here, on Earth, everything seemed to be the opposite. The human males she had been observing were not like the others Zara had studied. They were not focused on gaining power or advancing technologically. They weren't cold, calculating, or detached like the Vornek. Instead, they seemed driven by something much deeper, something Zara had never understood. Love, loyalty, and family were what fueled them. Zara didn't know why, but she couldn't stop watching them. The village where Zara had set up her observation post was small and simple. The homes were made of wood, and the streets were lined with trees. The humans in the village lived a quiet life, farming, building, and raising families. It seemed like a peaceful place, far removed from the chaos and conflicts Zara had experienced on other planets. And yet something about the way the human males carried themselves, the way they interacted with others, intrigued her. They didn't seem to live for power or glory. Instead, they seemed to live for each other. Zara spent most of her days watching them from a distance. She would observe their behavior in various situations, whether they were working, talking with their families, or dealing with a problem. At first, she thought she was just seeing normal human behavior, nothing special. But the more she watched, the more she began to notice patterns, patterns that were unlike anything she had seen in the other species she had studied. One morning, Zara observed a group of human males working together to repair a fence around the village's fields. She was hidden among the trees, her eyes trained on the men as they lifted heavy beams and hammered posts into the ground. Zara had expected to see the usual competition for dominance, but there was none of that here. These men weren't trying to outdo each other. They weren't pushing themselves to prove who was the strongest. Instead, they worked as a team, helping one another whenever someone needed assistance. If one man dropped a heavy beam, another would quickly step forward to help him. There were no complaints, no anger, just quiet cooperation. They didn't speak much, but the way they moved in unison showed they had a deep understanding of each other. Zara watched in awe. How could they work like this? In the Vornek Empire, efficiency was key. But this wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about working together, making sure no one was left behind. Zara couldn't understand it. In her culture, everyone worked for themselves. If someone needed help, it was a sign of weakness. But here, on Earth, the human males seemed to think differently. It was as though they were stronger together than apart. As the days passed, Zara began to notice more things that made the human males unique. She followed a man named David one afternoon as he walked home from the village's marketplace. David was a tall, strong man, his hands rough from years of work in the fields. As he approached his home, Zara saw his wife, Sarah, sitting on the porch, holding their young daughter, Lily. When David saw them, his face lit up. It wasn't just a smile, it was a look of pure joy. He kissed his wife on the cheek and lifted his daughter into his arms. The love and warmth in his eyes as he looked at his family were unmistakable. Zara couldn't take her eyes off the scene. She had never seen anything like it. In her culture, such displays of affection were rare. The Vornak were taught to suppress their emotions, to keep their feelings hidden. But here, David was openly displaying his love and affection for his family. There was no shame, no embarrassment, just pure, unfiltered love. Zara realized that the human males didn't just fight for survival or power. They fought for the ones they loved, for their families. Zara's fascination only grew as she continued to observe the human males. They worked hard every day, not just for themselves, but for their families, their communities. She saw how they protected their loved ones, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a deep emotional connection. In the Vornek Empire, soldiers fought to conquer and control, but these human males fought to protect, to preserve what mattered most to them. One evening, Zara watched as a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, and strong winds began to blow. The villagers hurried to prepare for the storm, securing their homes and bringing their animals into shelter. Zara watched as the human males sprang into action, working together to protect the town. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wait for orders. They knew what needed to be done, and they did it. Zara was amazed by how quickly they organized themselves, how they worked as a team, each man taking on a task without question. Even when the storm hit, the human males didn't retreat. They stayed outside, battling the wind and rain to make sure the town's animals were safe and the buildings were secure. Zara watched as they moved from one task to another, never stopping, never complaining. It was as if the storm didn't matter to them. They were focused on something more important: their community, their people, their families. The next morning, Zara went out into the village to see the aftermath of the storm. The damage was significant, but the town had survived. The human males had managed to protect the community, and they were already working together to fix the damage. Zara watched as they helped each other rebuild the fences, repair the roofs, and clean up the debris. They didn't ask for praise or recognition. They just worked quietly, side by side, each man doing his part. Zara could see the pride in their eyes, not for what they had done, but for the people they had protected. Zara had never seen anything like it. The human males didn't work for themselves. They didn't care about personal glory or status. They worked for each other, for the good of the community. Their strength didn't come from their physical abilities, but from their loyalty, their sense of responsibility, and their love for the people they cared about. As Zara continued her observations, she began to feel a shift inside her. She had come to Earth to study the human race, to gather information about a species that her people had dismissed as insignificant. But now she was beginning to question everything she had been taught. The human males were not like the other species Zara had encountered. They were not motivated by power or control. They were motivated by love, by loyalty, and by a deep sense of responsibility. Zara had always believed that strength came from physical power, from being the strongest and the smartest. But the more she watched the human males, the more she realized that their true strength came from something else. Their emotions, the love they had for their families, their willingness to protect and sacrifice for others, made them stronger than anything Zara had ever known. It was something the Vornak could never understand, something they had never been taught to value. Zara wasn't sure what to make of all this. She had come to Earth to observe, to gather data for the Vornak Empire. But now she found herself captivated by the human males and their strange, powerful emotions. She was beginning to see them in a new light. They were not weak. They were not primitive. They were strong, in ways the Vornak could never be. Zara's mission had been simple: observe the humans, gather information, and report back to the Vornak. But now she was beginning to realize that there was more to this planet than she had ever imagined. And as she continued to watch the human males, Zara couldn't help but wonder if her people had underestimated them all along. Zara had spent weeks observing the humans, especially the males. What began as a simple mission to gather data had turned into something more. Every day, she found herself more captivated by the human males' behavior, their emotions, and the deep love they had for their families. She began to feel conflicted. Zara was supposed to be detached and objective. She was trained to observe without getting emotionally involved. But the more she watched, the harder it became to remain distant. The human males were unlike any other species Zara had encountered. They didn't fight for power, like the aggressive alien species she had studied. They didn't live for personal glory. They fought to protect their families and communities. They worked hard every day to ensure that everyone was taken care of. And they showed an incredible amount of love and loyalty to the people they cared about. It was something Zara had never seen before in her travels. It was also something she found deeply intriguing. One evening, after another long day of observation, Zara sat on a hill overlooking the village. She had been following David again, the man who had caught her attention so many times. She had seen him work in the fields, laugh with his children, and show his wife tender affection. Tonight, however, she saw something different. David was standing alone by the river that ran through the village. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted with deep oranges and purples. Zara watched as David stared into the water, lost in thought. She had never seen him like this before. David was always surrounded by his family or working with the other men in the village. But tonight, he was alone. Zara wondered what was going through his mind. Why did he seem so distant all of a sudden? It was as if the love and warmth she had seen earlier had faded, replaced by something darker. Zara felt a strange pull in her chest, an urge to understand more about this man, to understand the complexity of his emotions. David's shoulders slumped as he stood there, his gaze still fixed on the river. Zara took a deep breath and decided to approach. She knew it was risky. She was supposed to remain hidden. But something told her that she needed to understand this moment, to understand what made David tick. Slowly, she crept forward, trying to make as little noise as possible. She stayed behind a large tree, just out of sight, but close enough to hear him. To Zara's surprise, David spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as though he were speaking to the river itself. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he said. "I've been working so hard, trying to keep everyone safe, but sometimes it feels like it's never enough." Zara froze. What was he talking about? From what Zara had seen, David was one of the hardest working men in the village. He was always there for his family, always doing whatever it took to make sure they had what they needed. She had never seen him hesitate, never seen him question himself. Yet here he was, standing alone, speaking about doubt and uncertainty. David's voice grew softer, and Zara strained to hear him clearly. "I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to protect them, that I'll fail them when they need me the most." Zara's heart raced as she listened. She had never imagined that the strong, confident man she had been watching for so long could feel fear. This was a side of him she hadn't expected. She had always believed that the human males were driven by their love for their families, and now she was beginning to understand that it wasn't just love that kept them going, it was fear too. Fear of failure, fear of losing those they cared about. It was a vulnerability Zara had never seen before, not in the other species she had studied. David was silent for a long moment, staring at the water. Zara felt her own emotions stir as she watched him. There was something deeply human about his struggle, something that made her feel both sympathy and admiration. She had always believed that emotions like fear were weaknesses, that they held people back. But now she was starting to see things differently. David's fear didn't make him weaker. It made him stronger. It drove him to work harder, to protect his family even more fiercely. Zara's thoughts were interrupted when David finally turned away from the river and walked back toward the village. She felt a pang of regret, wishing she had been able to understand him more fully. But she knew it was too late to approach him now. She watched him disappear into the darkness, still deep in thought. As she stood there, alone in the quiet night, something inside Zara began to shift. For the first time since her arrival on Earth, Zara felt the weight of her mission. She was supposed to be observing, gathering information to report back to the Vornak, but now she wasn't sure if she could do that. The more she watched the human males, the more she realized that they were complex, multi-dimensional beings. They weren't simply driven by emotions or logic. They were driven by both. Their love and their fear shaped them in ways Zara had never considered. They were not just tools for survival. They were capable of so much more. The next day, Zara continued her observations with a heavy heart. Her mind kept returning to David's words by the river. She wondered if all the human males felt this way, if they all struggled with fear and doubt, even as they worked tirelessly to protect their families. She thought about the other men in the village, the way they worked together, the way they cared for each other. It was clear that they had a bond, a shared understanding of what it meant to be human. But Zara was beginning to realize that there was so much more to their bond than just loyalty. There was an emotional depth to the human males that Zara had never fully understood until now. Later that afternoon, Zara decided to visit the marketplace in the village. She knew it would be another opportunity to observe the human males in a different setting. The marketplace was lively, filled with vendors selling fruits, vegetables, and handmade goods. Zara watched as the men interacted with the women and children. They didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged stories, laughter, and support. Zara saw how the men helped the older women carry baskets, how they picked up the children and swung them around, making them laugh. There was something special about the way the human males treated everyone around them. They weren't just warriors or workers. They were fathers, sons, and husbands. They were part of a larger community, one that relied on each other for survival and for happiness. Zara realized that the bond between them wasn't just about protecting their families. It was about being part of something bigger. It was about being connected to each other, to the community. This was something she had never seen in her own culture, and it made her feel a deep sense of awe and respect. As the day drew to a close, Zara sat alone on the hill again, reflecting on what she had learned. She had come to Earth with the goal of studying the human males, but now she realized that what she had discovered was more than just a simple observation. The human males were not like the other species Zara had encountered. They were driven by emotions, yes, but also by an unbreakable bond to their families and communities. They were vulnerable, yes, but it was their vulnerability that made them strong. Zara had come to Earth to understand the human race, But now she was starting to question everything she thought she knew. The more she learned about the human males, the more she realized that they were unlike any species she had encountered before. They were capable of great love, great fear, and great sacrifice. They had the strength to protect, but also the courage to face their own weaknesses. And as Zara sat there, looking out over the village, she realized something even more profound. Perhaps the humans weren't the weak species her people had assumed them to be. Perhaps in their own way, they were stronger than the Vornek. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside her. For weeks, she had observed the human males, studying their behavior, trying to understand them. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet of her observation post, she realized that she was no longer just observing. She was beginning to feel what they felt. The human males had shown her their strength, not through their physical power, but through their emotions. The way they loved their families, the way they protected their communities, and even their fears. All of it had begun to seep into Zara's thoughts and heart. It was as though she was starting to understand them in a way she never thought possible. What was once an academic exercise had turned into something much deeper, something more personal. Zara's mind kept returning to David. She couldn't forget the way he had stood by the river, his voice filled with doubt and fear, speaking about his need to protect his family. That moment had changed everything for Zara. She had seen the human males as strong, capable beings, but now she saw them as more than that. She saw them as individuals, each carrying their own burdens, their own fears and dreams. David's vulnerability had opened a new door for her, a door to understanding that strength wasn't just about power or physical might. It was about the ability to face your own weaknesses and continue moving forward for the sake of those you loved. Zara had been trained to observe without becoming emotionally involved, but she couldn't help it. The more she watched, the more she felt connected to the humans. She had come to Earth with a mission, to gather information, to study the human males for the Vornek Empire. But now she found herself questioning her mission. Was it really just about gathering data? Or was there something more here, something deeper, that her people didn't understand? The Vornek Empire had always prided itself on its logical, efficient ways. Emotions were seen as distractions, weaknesses to be avoided at all costs. Zara had believed this. She had been taught to value strength, control, and power. But now she was starting to wonder if the Vornek were wrong. The human males she had observed were strong, but not in the way the Vornek defined strength. Their strength came from their emotions, from their love, their fear, and their devotion to their families. It was a different kind of strength, one that Zara didn't fully understand, but one she had come to admire. One afternoon, as Zara was walking through the forest near the village, she stumbled upon something that would change everything. She had been trying to clear her mind, to think about what she had learned and what she was starting to feel. But as she walked deeper into the trees, she heard voices. Curiosity piqued. Zara crept closer to the source of the sound, moving quietly so as not to be noticed. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. David was standing in the clearing, surrounded by 3 other men. Zara had never seen these men before, but she could tell they were close. There was an unspoken bond between them, a bond that reminded Zara of the camaraderie she had seen between the human males during their work in the village. But this moment was different. The mood was tense. Zara could sense that something important was happening. David was speaking, but his voice was low, almost pleading. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this," he said. "I've been working nonstop, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." One of the other men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a deep voice, stepped forward. "You don't have to do this alone, David," he said. "We're all in this together. You've helped us before. Now it's our turn to help you." Zara watched in silence, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. David had been so strong, so self-reliant, but now he was admitting that he needed help. It was a moment of vulnerability that Zara hadn't expected. It was a revelation. The other men stepped forward and placed their hands on David's shoulders, showing their support. Zara could see that the bond between them was real, forged through years of shared experiences and struggles. It wasn't just about working together or protecting each other. It was about something deeper. It was about trust. These men trusted one another with their lives, and they weren't afraid to admit when they needed help. Zara felt a lump form in her throat as she watched them. This was the strength she had been searching for. The strength that came from vulnerability, from being able to lean on others when you needed to. David's face softened as he looked at his friends. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you." Zara couldn't tear her eyes away. She realized then that she had been wrong about strength all along. Strength wasn't about doing everything on your own, about carrying the weight of the world without asking for help. Strength was about knowing when you couldn't do it alone, and being willing to lean on others. It was about building bonds, about trusting the people around you, and about showing that even the strongest among them needed support. It was a revelation that shook Zara to her core. As the men stood together, Zara's heart swelled with emotion. She had come to Earth to learn about the human males. But now she was learning something far more important. She was learning about what it truly meant to be strong. The human males were not invincible. They weren't perfect. They had their flaws, their fears, and their doubts. But that didn't make them weak. In fact, it made them stronger. They weren't afraid to show their vulnerability. And that was what made them so powerful. Zara felt a wave of respect for the men before her. She had seen them work, protect, and fight. But now she saw them in a new light. They were not just warriors or providers. They were fathers, brothers, friends. They were human in every sense of the word. And it was their humanity, their ability to connect with each other, that made them powerful. As she turned to leave the clearing, Zara realized that she had learned something more than she ever expected. She had come to Earth to study the human males. But now she was beginning to understand what made them truly strong. It wasn't just about physical power or survival. It was about love, trust, and vulnerability. The human males didn't hide their emotions or suppress their fears. They embraced them, and in doing so, they became stronger. Zara knew that her mission was coming to an end. She had gathered all the information she needed to report back to the Vornek Empire, but now she wasn't sure if she could do that. She had come to Earth with one purpose, but now she felt torn. The more she had learned about the human males, the more she realized that they were unlike any species she had encountered before. They were capable of things the Vornek could never understand. They were capable of love, of trust, and of vulnerability. And that made them stronger than anything Zara had ever known. As she made her way back to her observation post, Zara's mind was filled with questions. What would she tell the Vornek? Could she go back and explain everything she had learned? Could she even bring herself to share her findings with them? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. Her time on Earth had changed her, and she couldn't ignore the truth she had discovered about the human males. Their strength wasn't in their physical power, it was in their hearts. The days that followed Zara's revelation were filled with confusion and uncertainty. Zara had learned more about the human males than she had ever anticipated. They weren't just physical beings driven by instinct or survival. They were full of emotion, capable of love, fear, and sacrifice. Their strength came not from domination or control, but from their ability to connect with each other, to depend on one another, and to admit when they were vulnerable. Zara had always been taught that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. But what she had observed in the humans had shaken that belief to its core. Their ability to embrace their emotions, to ask for help when needed, and to share their burdens made them stronger in ways Zara never imagined. This new understanding left her with conflicting emotions. Her mission, at its core, was to study the human males for the Vornek Empire. She had been trained to gather information about them and report back. But now, she wasn't sure if she could do that. What she had learned had changed her view of the human race. She felt a connection to the humans that she hadn't expected. And yet, she knew her superiors back on the Vornak homeworld would never understand. Zara found herself standing at a crossroads. She was supposed to report back to the Vornak, to share her findings, but she had begun to see the human males differently. She couldn't deny the admiration and respect she felt for them. She couldn't ignore the deep, almost protective feeling that had begun to grow inside her when she thought about the humans. They weren't just another species to study. They were beings who had their own struggles, their own hopes and dreams. They had a complex, beautiful nature that Zara had come to respect. But there was a bigger issue at hand: Zara's superiors. The Vornak had always seen other species as tools to be used, as objects to be studied and controlled. They didn't value emotions the way the humans did. The Vornak's philosophy was based on logic, power, and efficiency. To them, emotions were distractions, weaknesses that had no place in their society. Zara knew that if she reported her findings honestly, it could lead to a disaster. The Vornak would never understand why she had come to care for the humans. They wouldn't see the strength in their vulnerability. They wouldn't see the beauty in their emotional connections. One day, while Zara was deep in thought, trying to decide what to do, she received an unexpected message from the Vornak command. It was a direct order to return immediately. Her mission had ended. The Vornak wanted her back. Zara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was it. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. She had been waiting for this order, but now that it came, she wasn't sure she could leave. She wasn't sure she could turn her back on what she had learned about the humans. But she knew she had no choice. If she refused, it would be considered an act of treason. With a heavy heart, Zara packed her things and prepared to leave. She knew she had to report back to the Vornak, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning something important, something she had come to value deeply. As she left her hiding place in the forest, Zara caught a glimpse of David. He was standing with his friends again, laughing as they worked together, their bond stronger than ever. Seeing them made Zara's heart ache. They were everything she had come to admire: their strength, their unity, and their love for each other. Zara wanted to stay, to learn more, to protect them. But she knew she couldn't. She had a responsibility to her people, to the Vornak, and they would never understand what she had learned. She made her way to the ship that would take her back to the Vornak homeworld. Her mind was racing, torn between duty and the connection she had formed with the humans. The flight back was long, and the silence in the ship felt unbearable. Zara tried to push her feelings aside, telling herself that she had made the right decision. But the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. She had seen the strength in the human males, their ability to love, to fight for their families, and to trust one another. It was something Zara had never experienced in her own people. The Vornak were cold, calculating, and logical, but they lacked the warmth and depth that made the humans so extraordinary. As the ship descended toward the Vornak capital, Zara felt a sense of dread settle in her chest. She knew what was waiting for her: a debriefing, questions about her findings, and an expectation that she would report her observations without emotional attachment. But how could she do that? How could she explain the strength she had witnessed in the humans without showing how deeply it had affected her? How could she lie to her superiors when everything inside her wanted to protect the humans, to keep them safe from the cold, unfeeling logic of the Vornak? When Zara landed on the Vornak homeworld, she was immediately escorted to the council chambers. The atmosphere was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth and life she had seen among the humans. The Vornak leaders, seated at a long table, looked at her with sharp, calculating eyes. They didn't seem to care about her personal feelings. They wanted results, facts, data, and analysis. Zara, the chief strategist, Rether, said with his usual stern tone, "You have completed your mission. We trust you have gathered valuable information on the human males. Please present your findings." Zara stood in front of the council, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she began to speak, but her voice remained steady. She told them about the humans' physical strength, their survival instincts, and their ability to work together as a community. But as she spoke, she couldn't help but remember the vulnerable moments she had witnessed. The way David had shown fear, the way the men had leaned on each other for support, the love they had for their families. Zara took a deep breath, then continued. But there is something more, something that cannot be measured in data or power. The human males possess something that is difficult to describe. They are driven by emotions, by love, fear, and a sense of duty. These emotions are not weaknesses. In fact, they make them stronger. They are capable of forming deep emotional bonds with one another, and they rely on these bonds for strength. They do not fear vulnerability. They embrace it. The room was silent as the council processed Zara's words. Zara could feel the weight of their gaze, their judgment. She knew that the Vornak would never understand the value of emotions. They would see this as a weakness, something that made the humans inferior. And yet, Zara couldn't bring herself to retract her words. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. The human males were strong, stronger than anything the Vornak could understand. Rether leaned forward, his voice cold and harsh. Zara, you have failed to provide us with concrete data. You are suggesting that emotions are a source of strength. That is illogical. Emotions are distractions. They cloud judgment and weaken the individual. We have no use for such nonsense. Zara felt a wave of anger wash over her. She knew she was taking a risk by challenging the Vornak's way of thinking. But she couldn't back down. Not now. I disagree, Zara said, her voice steady but firm. The human males are strong because of their emotions, not in spite of them. They protect their families, their communities, and their people because they care. They fight not for power, but for love. That is their strength. Rether's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Zara spoke again. If you do not understand that, then you do not understand the true power of the human race. They are capable of greatness, greatness that the Vornak will never achieve. There was a long pause, and Zara could feel the tension in the room. She didn't know what would happen next. Would she be punished for her words? Would the Vornak consider her a traitor for believing in the humans? Finally, Rether spoke, his tone colder than ever. Zara, you are dismissed. You have provided your findings, but your personal opinions are irrelevant. You will remain under observation until further notice. Zara's heart sank. She had known this would happen. The Vornak would never accept what she had learned. But at least she had spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had made her choice. As she left the council chambers, Zara couldn't help but think of the human males, their strength, their vulnerability, and the love they shared. She knew she couldn't go back to her old way of thinking. She had seen the truth, and she couldn't unsee it. The humans were not just a species to be studied. They were a species to be admired. Zara walked out of the council chambers with a heavy heart. The cold, sterile walls of the Vornak capital seemed to close in around her as she moved through the halls, her footsteps echoing with every step. She had expected this, expected them to reject her findings, to dismiss everything she had learned about the humans. But even though she knew it was coming, the rejection still stung. The Vornak had always been a race of logic, efficiency, and control. They prided themselves on their ability to distance themselves from emotion, to remain calm and rational in every situation. They saw emotions as weaknesses, as distractions that clouded judgment and slowed progress. To them, Zara's observations about the human male's strength coming from their emotions made no sense. It was a view so far removed from their own that they couldn't fathom it. And yet, Zara couldn't shake the truth she had discovered. The humans were different. They were not perfect. They had flaws, they had weaknesses, and they were not invincible. But their strength came from something far more powerful than physical might or cold logic. It came from their ability to love, to feel, and to connect with each other. It came from their emotions, the very thing the Vornak despised. As Zara walked through the corridors of the Vornak Council building, she could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had made a choice, one that she couldn't undo. Her report had been submitted. The Vornak had heard what she had to say, and they had rejected it. Now, there was only one thing left for Zara to do, to decide where her loyalty truly lay. For the first time since her mission had begun, Zara questioned everything. She had come to Earth with a single purpose, to study the human males, to gather information for the Vornak Empire. She had been trained for this, had been prepared for the mission, and she had done what she was supposed to do. But now that she had learned what she had learned, Zara wasn't sure what to do next. She had witnessed something extraordinary among the humans, something the Vornak could never understand. The humans' ability to love, to trust, and to depend on one another had shown Zara a side of life she had never known. Zara stopped in the hallway, leaning against the cold metal wall. Her mind raced as she thought back to everything she had seen during her time on Earth. She remembered David, standing with his friends, vulnerable and open. He had admitted his fears, his weaknesses, but he had done so without shame. He had trusted his friends, relying on them for support, just as they relied on him. It was in moments like that that Zara had come to understand the true meaning of strength. The humans were not afraid to show their emotions, and that made them stronger, not weaker. But Zara knew the Vornak would never accept that. They would never understand it. The Vornak were a people built on logic and efficiency. To them, emotions were distractions, not sources of power. The Vornak valued control above all else, and anything that threatened that control was seen as a weakness. Zara had known that going into this mission, but now, standing here, she realized that she couldn't go back to that cold, emotionless way of thinking. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and she couldn't unsee it. So, what was she supposed to do now? Zara took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She had two choices, two paths that lay before her, each leading in a different direction. She could go back to the Vornak, return to her superiors, and report everything as they expected. She could tell them what they wanted to hear, how the human males were weak, how their emotions made them inferior, how the Vornak were the superior race. That would be the safe choice. It would be the logical choice. The Vornak would be pleased with her obedience, and she could go back to living her life as she had before. But there was another choice. Zara could turn her back on the Vornak, on everything she had ever known, and join the humans. She could go to them, protect them, and learn more from them. She could stand by their side, not as an observer, but as someone who truly understood their strength, the strength that came from their emotions. The choice wasn't easy. It wasn't clear. But Zara knew deep down that it was the right one. She had learned so much about the human males, and in the process, she had learned something about herself. She had learned that emotions were not weaknesses. They were the very thing that made life worth living, that made people fight for something greater than themselves. The Vornak could never understand that, but the humans did. They understood the power of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Zara had seen it in their eyes, in the way they cared for one another, in the way they fought for each other. It was something she had never experienced with her own people, and it was something she now realized she couldn't ignore. Zara closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't return to the Vornak, couldn't report back to them without betraying everything she had learned. The Vornak would never accept what she had seen. They would never accept the truth about the human males. But the humans would. They would understand. Zara made her decision. With determination in her heart, she turned and walked down the corridor, heading for the shuttle bay. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't turn her back on the humans, on the strength they had shown her. As she entered the shuttle bay, Zara saw the ship that would take her back to Earth. Her heart beat faster as she approached it. This was it, the moment of no return. She had made her choice. She would join the humans. She would protect them, stand by them, and learn from them. She would not let them face the future alone. Zara stepped onto the shuttle, her mind focused on the path ahead. She didn't know what would happen when she arrived on Earth, or how the humans would receive her. She didn't know if they would accept her, or if they would see her as a threat. But she was willing to take that risk. She was willing to fight for them, to fight for what she had learned was the true meaning of strength. As the shuttle lifted off from the Vornak homeworld, Zara looked out the window, watching as the planet disappeared from view. She felt a sense of freedom, of possibility, in her chest. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. She was no longer an observer. She was a part of something bigger, something that transcended logic and efficiency. She was a part of the human race, a race defined not by power, but by the strength of its emotions. Zara knew that she had found something far more valuable than anything the Vornak could offer. She had found a new way of looking at the world, a way that was full of hope, love, and connection. And that was a strength she could never turn away from.